Peter, I'm really appreciative of you joining me. And for anybody listening, you got to read the Football Morning America. I'm sure you all do. It's been a staple for years. And first of all, as a fellow reporter and writer, I admire the energy that it has to take to continue to do this year after year, every week. I don't like, do you drink more coffee these days? How do you compensate for, you get older and it's harder to work into the night like that?
Well,
How do,
John, the difference now, quite honestly, is that I only write one day a week. So this, I really think when I was doing the MMQB and working full time at Sports Illustrated, the last 5 years where I did both that website and this column, I'm not saying it took X number of years off my life, but my sleeping habits were terrible. And I drank way too much coffee in those days. But what I've done now, honestly, and what I'm going to continue to do this coming year is that I basically write my column over a 2 or 3 day period. And when you do that, and when you have other things in the column that can be done earlier in the week, like answering the mail and all that other stuff, then when you get to 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, you've already got 4,000 words in the bank. So then it's a sprint over the next, say, 13 hours to get another 5,000 or 6,000 words. And that's basically how I do it.
But you make it sound like one day a week. That's a lot for one day a week. That's what I mean. So I deeply admire what you're able to do with it.
Thank you.
So, but let's go to the field and starting in Washington, there's so much to touch on here, but I want to start in the field. And first, for you, as someone who's covered this industry a long time, and I asked Bob Glauber this several months ago, how weird has it been for you to watch what's gone on in the NFC East and also this franchise in particular over the years?
Well, John, I started covering the NFC East in 1985 when I was hired by Newsday to cover the Giants and to write an NFL column. And so when I think back to those days, one of the things that I remember vividly, and I mean vividly, is the trips to RFK Stadium. Those were some of my best memories covering the NFL by far. Because if you think about it, John, the one thing about that level of fervor for a team that's so different than today is, and so I'm sure that people who will remember RFK will remember that when there were big moments in the fourth quarters of big games, the stadium would shake. It would reverberate. We'd be up in the press box, which was a little microscopic press box, really. We'd be up in the press box, and the first time it happened, I said, "Oh my God, this stadium's going to collapse." and I just remember every game that I ever covered there, the day of the game, if it was a Sunday, I think I covered 2 Monday night games there, but the day of the game, if it was a Sunday, just devouring every word in the Washington Post, getting ready for the game. And then oftentimes I'd either take a cab or get a ride there and get dropped off. And as you're walking the last few hundred yards to the stadium, the one thing that really stuck out to me is how important it was to everybody there. It just was, that was as big an event town as Green Bay is with the Packers. It just was. And I think one of the reasons why I've been so down on Daniel Snyder is that, and I'm not saying he alone ruined that, but far and away, he's the biggest contributor to ruining what happened to a once great cornerstone NFL franchise. And it's just, I'm not trying to throw darts at anybody, but I mean, it's just, anybody can look at this. It's a fact.
Mm-hmm.
His reign of ownership has been an abject disaster. And if he had one shred of decency, he would say, I've got to sell this. If I really love this team and I really love this town, for the good of the people who live here, who love this team, I've got to sell this team and we've got to move on. But obviously he's not doing that.
What do you hear from other owners or around the league about any of that, and about, because there's obviously, owners get frustrated and you hear a lot of things. Where do you think they're at with whether it's wanting him to sell or versus forcing him to sell and having the votes to get him to sell?
I think it's going to be very difficult unless something very untoward surfaces in this latest complaint against him, sexual harassment. I think it's going to be difficult because even though everything that he's done really amounts to, a scandal, or everything that has happened in his organization amounts to a scandal, I'm not sure it rises to the level of getting the franchise stripped from him. And so I think most owners are pragmatic about it until something more happens than what has surfaced to this point. And obviously there was some excellent reporting by the Post and about, all the women who felt abused and belittled and demeaned by members of the staff and or members of, Daniel Snyder's inner circle, including Snyder. I just don't think it rises to the level of being able to take the franchise away from it.
Do you think that, and again, I'll stay on the Snyder part for a few minutes here. What do you think, what kind of teeth do you think the congressional hearing will have? And do you expect Snyder and Goodell to show up for that?
I would be surprised if Snyder showed up without a subpoena.
Me too.
Can you imagine if they start berating Daniel Snyder? He'll fight back.
Yeah.
And his attorney has to be thinking, there is no way I am allowing my client to appear before Congress to get the crap beat out of him. I'm not allowing that to happen. Now, I'm unsure if that group has the ability to subpoena Daniel Snyder. We'll see. But I think there's a much better chance of Goodell appearing. I don't know if he will or not, but I mean, Roger Goodell, even though I'm sure that Daniel Snyder feels some level of abandonment by some in the NFL and probably sometimes by Goodell, I think most of the rest of us thought that fining him $10 million and not suspending him was a slap on the wrist for what happened with the organization. But I'm sure you hear it, John, that he thought that he got waylaid by this. Right. But whatever. Can you imagine what Roger Goodell must be feeling at the prospect? I have to go in there and take fastballs to the head because of this idiot. I mean, think about that. Think what Roger Goodell would be thinking. I have to take a day out of my life to go to Washington and to get prepared from our attorneys to appear before Congress in what will be on every channel in Washington, and will be a huge story on ESPN and everywhere. And I have to do that because of Daniel Snyder. It's just, I'm shocked, honestly, at the whole scenario, and shocked of, what happened to this team. And I just hope that Jason Wright who is a very good person, and who's an earnest, hardworking, serious about this franchise guy. I just hope that he can find some way to turn it around. I mean, I find myself, look, I root for the teams that need to turn around. And it's a weird thing to say. A few years ago, I was thinking about how bad the teams in the Rust Belt generally were. Like, we call it the Rust Belt, but
Right.
Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit. And I don't root for any team per se. I don't like it if a team has been horrible forever.
Right.
So like this year, I'd love to see the Lions get turned around. They're poor fans, how much they've suffered.
Right.
And I never thought in a million years I'd say the same thing about Washington, but that's almost the way I feel about them now.
Well, I was going to ask you too, you brought up Jason Wright, also Ron Rivera here. Do you feel like that they have the right people in place to maybe get something going here?
I think they do. I mean, it's, John, as you know, the way I kind of feel about NFL franchises is, Zach Taylor was a far better coach when he had Joe Burrow for 17 games.
Right.
And Ron Rivera is probably going to be a much better coach with Carson Wentz as his quarterback versus sort of the collection of quarterbacks he's had to use the last couple of years. So I guess I kind of look at it like, I think Ron Rivera is a fine coach. I really do. But if Carson Wentz can't come back from a horrible end of the season last year in Indianapolis, if he is a C- quarterback, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen to Rivera. I don't know what'll happen to the staff. I don't know who is going to get blown out, but it all depends on the quarterback. Now, I definitely think Rivera, in terms of temperament, is a great guy to be the coach of this team because he can take all the punching bag crap that he's got to deal with, as can Jason Wright. And for how long, I don't know, but I don't think it'd be good for Ron Rivera if they went 5-12 this year.
No, agreed. And when you look at Carson Wentz, because we hear a lot about how he was in the locker room, you hear a lot about this and about that, but you hear a lot of you hear that sometimes too with other quarterbacks who have had success.
Right.
And I think there's this perception that maybe like, oh, you just have to be this great guy among all the players, but it's not always the case. Do you think he can turn on, based on what you hear, can he be the guy still at this level? And how good do you think he could be?
I definitely give him a shot. I mean, John, you know what people don't know about what happened in Indianapolis last year? This is something that I remember, from very early on, the early days of Wentz in Indianapolis. Frank Reich really wanted Carson Wentz. He thought it was a 2-year reclamation project. Right. Okay. Not 1 year. And so Frank Reich basically settled into just the simple knowledge, the simple fact that he was going to have a couple of years with Carson Wentz, at least. Okay. But what ended up happening was, I think that the end of his season and the opinion of Jim Irsay about Wentz, sort of the end of his season really just killed Wentz in Indianapolis. And I think one of the things that probably, hurt him, as much as anything, is just the simple fact that he had an owner who had totally lost faith in him.
Right.
And although Jim Irsay does leave the football, up to Chris Ballard and Frank Reich. He does do that, but he's not a shrinking violet when it comes to making his opinion known. And I think, honestly, when down the stretch of the season, you miss a game due to COVID, and then, you're all apologetic about missing a game due to COVID and said, I think many in the organization felt, hey, dude, don't give us your apologies about missing the game due to COVID. Just stop. You're the one who had it in your control to get vaccinated. You chose not to, and we suffered. And then the way he ended the season against Vegas, against Jacksonville, just simply not making enough big plays, it doomed him. And so I think Mike Florio said this, and I totally agree with him. And I think the Colts agree with him too, that the best thing that could happen to Carson Wentz is to go somewhere where he doesn't have a godfather there. He got drafted in Philadelphia, where Frank Reich and Doug Peterson, honestly, if you can't play for Frank Reich and Doug Peterson, you've got to go be a professional bowler. I mean, they're the greatest coaches to play for, particularly Reich. But at the end of his time in Philadelphia, he got crossways with Doug Peterson. How possibly you can do that is beyond me. And I think it was immaturity on his part. And the fact that he'll never say this, John, but Carson Wentz did not recover from it being Nick Foles with the statue outside the link and not him. He did not respond well to the fact that he was drafted to be the man, and he was on his way to being the man and maybe on his way to winning a Super Bowl, and he got hurt. Unfortunately, that's the way the game goes sometimes. And then he just couldn't deal with the fact that somebody else won the Super Bowl that should have been his. I doubt he'll admit that, but that's what happened. And so, look, he needs to go somewhere where it is a totally fresh start, and he doesn't have the sort of the put your arm around my shoulder and everything is going to be okay, Carson. He needs to go prove himself somewhere. And I happen to think there's a good chance he'll be able to do it. And, he certainly is going to have the opportunity in Washington. There is no backup plan, really. This is going to be his team for either 1 or 2 years. And it was Troy Aikman who said it recently. This is it.
Right.
This is last best chance. If you don't want to end up being Ryan Fitzpatrick and being a backup, for 15 years, now's the time to do something about it.
Do you think they have enough around him to make him that effective? And how do you feel they stack up in the NFC East?
I mean, I think they definitely have the ability to be competitive in that division. They've shown the ability. They have a very, very good defensive front, obviously. And so they're going to be competitive defensively, I think, regardless of what happens on offense. Let's just talk about this year. It's hard to know really what the future holds, but when you've got a defensive front of, Chase Young, Montez Sweat on the outside, and Payne and Allen, I guess, would be the two inside guys to start. I mean, that's really, really good. They're not quite as good in the secondary, obviously. They're just okay back there, but I do think they're going to be able to get enough pressure to be a real significant force, defensively. Now, I think a lot of what happens on this team is going to depend on, obviously, you've got Terry McLaurin, who is the standard bearer for this offense. But obviously, with Dotson and Curtis Samuel, you just really don't know. You think you're going to be okay, and you're going to be pretty deep, at the receiver position. But compared to everybody else in the division, particularly, I mean, Philadelphia is better at receiver. Dallas is better at receiver. The Giants, I have no idea what they are. Because who is Kadarius Toney? I have no idea. Who is Kenny Golladay going to be available? I don't know. We'll see. But I just look at they can be competitive. They can be good enough on offense. Their line is good enough, and they should have enough tools, to have Carson Wentz be successful.
Okay, we got a couple minutes left, so I wanted to get to some of the Hall of Fame stuff too, because a lot of fans here, obviously, as you know, every fan base feels like their guy gets slighted by the Hall of Fame. So, but I am curious about two guys in particular, Joe Jacoby, then Brian Mitchell. With Jake, what do you think held him up to getting in the Hall, and what do you think maybe the chances are would be with the senior committee down the road for him?
He's got some champions in the room without any question. And probably I am a little bit colored by the fact that, I covered a lot of Giants games in those days against Washington, where Lawrence Taylor, I'm not saying Lawrence Taylor didn't dominate Joe Jacoby. It was a competitive thing. And I think Joe Jacoby at the time was one of the best tackles in the NFL. If he got in, I don't think it would be if he got in, I don't think it would be a bad move. I'm just pretty lukewarm about his case, John, because I think, and look, you're right when you say that a lot of fan bases get passionate about their guys. Sure. I get campaigned every year for Carl Mecklenburg, or for years I did, Carl Mecklenburg and Randy Gradishar, in Denver, and everybody has got some people who they are very, very pent up about. And Jacoby is the guy. And look, I realize that I'm the guy on the dartboard for a lot of Washington fans because of the Art Monk days. Sure. And look, I think if we are to do a good job in voting for the Hall of Fame, and in Art Monk's last year, I voted for him because I saw the groundswell of support, and I sort of compared him to kind of the Harry Carson of the New York Giants, and as sort of that kind of leader,
right?
And not necessarily a holler guy, but just a real leader of that team. And so I voted for him. But when I covered those games, John, Gary Clark and Ricky Sanders were the guys who the Giants were worried about. Those are the guys who had the big games against the Giants many times. And I don't remember the stats, but that memory was fresh in my mind. And so I think that those are the things that it's not easy to sit there against the groundswell, but if you can't sit there against the groundswell and vote your conscience, you shouldn't be on the committee.
Absolutely. Brian Mitchell. And now this is a tough one because returners aren't getting in there. And I wonder how his is tied to a Devin Hester maybe getting in. Do you see a chance? And the one thing I always like with Brian is he filled 4 or 5 roles for them, and he filled them very well, and more so than this as a returner. But how do you see the candidacy for Brian Mitchell? How important is it for Hester to get in as well?
I mean, I was in favor of Devin Hester's case. Look, and I think eventually Devin Hester is going to get in. I don't know when, but he's going to get in at some point. And yeah, I think it would be significant because if you're not really electing and enshrining return men, it's hard to, in my opinion, to have somebody go in over Devin Hester. So yes, him going in, I think, would really help Mitchell.
Do you think he has a shot
Yes, I
Okay.
definitely think he has a shot, because if you look at, and look, it's been a few years since I really looked at his case, but I like Brian Mitchell's case. I think he led the NFL 4 different seasons in all-purpose yardage. He, for a long time, he was the standard bearer among punt return guys in the NFL. And then he had a little bit of a renaissance later in his career, returning kicks too.
Right.
So he did it. Brian Mitchell, among all-time returners, is like the Lifetime Achievement Award.
Right.
I just think he is absolutely deserving of strong consideration, just because he did it at a high level for a long time. Usually, John, you know what you see? You see these guys, they're like meteors streaking across the sky.
Right.
They last for a year or two, or maybe 3, 4, or 5 years, but they don't last for whatever Brian did it, like 13 years or whatever it was. And here's the other thing I like about Brian Mitchell's case. Okay. If you look at it, and I'm going to be wrong on the dates here, he played whatever it was from 90 to whatever, like 13 years, whatever it was. But if you look at the beginning of his career, returning kicks and returning punts, okay, and you look at the end of his career, he had like an 11 or 12-year run of near dominance.
Yeah.
And yes, it is a niche thing, the return game. I get that. But the other thing about his career that I think is so interesting is that, how about all the years that they needed him in the running game?
Yeah.
I mean, you look at some of those years, he's rushing it 70 or 80 times for a good average.
Yeah.
His yards per carry was good. And the other thing he did that I think is so cool is, you could rely on him to be almost like an option quarterback.
Yep.
Because he had a very good arm and they weren't afraid to use it. And, I don't know how many passes he threw in his career, not many, but he was a threat in that way. So I don't know. I think he is really one of the unique players to consider of all the guys in Hall of Fame consideration.
Peter, I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining me.
John, no problem. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Hey everybody, it's John Keim. Do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and I'll continue to bring you guests who provide excellent insight into the Washington Commanders. And while you're here, check out the other terrific content on the Empire Media Network, including Inside the Cap with Joel Corey and All's Caps with Steve Wino and former Washington Capital Carl Alsner. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Thank you.